11 minutes. That's how long the pilot of the Cessna 310 fought for control after experiencing a rudder hard over immediately after takeoff. He was ultimately unsuccessful and crashed attempting to land. It was a terrible tragedy resulting in the loss of 3 lives, and I think it's worth taking a look at. My name is Kerry McCauley, and welcome to my channel. Last Friday morning, April 11th, Robert Stark, his son Stephen, and granddaughter Brooke took off from the Boca Raton Airport in Robert's Cessna 310 for a short flight to Tallahassee to visit Florida State University, where Brooke was thinking of attending. Immediately after takeoff, or possibly during takeoff, they experienced a rudder hard over, jamming the rudder full left. What followed was an 11-minute ordeal and fight for survival, which they ultimately lost.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
It must have been extremely difficult to control the 310 with the rudder jammed all the way left. And you can see here from the ADS-B data that all they could do after takeoff was make left-hand turns. They were, however, able to get the plane to track somewhat straight because it looks like they made about 5 different attempts to get the plane back onto the runway before finally losing control in the last attempt. Now everybody's wondering how and why the rudder got jammed in the first place. And some people are speculating that maybe they forgot to move the rudder gust lock like this one. Personally, I think that might not be the case for a few different reasons. First of all, a big red gust lock on your rudder is kind of hard to miss during your pre-flight and walk-around. Remember, both Robert and his son Stephen were pilots, and that's just something that's kind of hard to miss. Although not impossible, there have been some very experienced pilots who've missed control locks on their walk-around and have actually taken off with that, so definitely a possibility. Secondly, it'd be really hard to taxi with your rudder locked like that. You'd have to do a lot of differential braking, and making the corners would be pretty tough, and you think Robert would have noticed something like that. And third, from what I understand, this plane was normally kept hangared. And for most pilots, if you put a plane in the hangar, you don't bother with the gust lock. It's just unnecessary, and you probably wouldn't do that. But again, anything's possible. But it doesn't really matter if they forgot a gust lock, or possibly something broke inside the airplane, inside the control linkages maybe, or maybe the tail jammed the rudder somehow. Because what I want to talk about here is what they might have done differently. Now, I know it's really easy to sit here a week later and Monday morning quarterback. I wasn't in the plane, I didn't experience it, but I think we can take a look at what happened and maybe we can learn something from it. First of all, I want to commend Robert on doing a great job of keeping the airplane under control in what is probably one of the most difficult situations a pilot can find himself in, and that's a rudder hard over in a multi-engine airplane. Because multi-engine airplanes have bigger rudders than normal, so they can be controlled in the event of an engine out. So flying around with that rudder all the way over had to be extremely difficult. And Robert was no slouch of a pilot. In addition to being a multi-engine and instrument-rated pilot, he was also a competitive aerobatic pilot, so I'm sure his stick and rudder skills were definitely above average. Now, like I mentioned, all he could do was left-hand turns, and it appears from the ADS-B data they didn't get much higher than 600 or 700 feet during the whole ordeal, and I think that was because he was trying to get back to the runway and time his turns, at a low altitude, basically a base to final altitude, so one of those left-hand turns would line him up with the runway. Unfortunately, he lost control on the last attempt and crashed, but it looked like he was getting relatively lined up with the runway in that attempt. He just ran out of luck. Now, I'm sure during the whole ordeal they were stomping on that right rudder, trying to free it. Whoever's up front with him was probably helping him. And they were probably also using, full right aileron to keep the wings level, and differential power on the 2 engines, using asymmetric thrust to try to control it. But in the end, it just proved to be too difficult. So what, if anything, could they have done differently? Well, first of all, you have to understand that there are 2 basic types of aircraft emergencies. Time-critical emergencies, where the situation is deteriorating rapidly and you have to get the plane on the ground as soon as possible, like an engine fire where the fire is burning through your wing root, or non-time critical emergencies where you've got a little bit of time and things are happening just a little bit slower, like an alternator failure or getting lost. And yes, I understand that all aviation emergencies are time critical because you can't stay up there forever. But if you find yourself in a non-time critical emergency, sometimes the best thing to do is to stop and think about what the best course of action is before just trying to get onto the ground as quickly as possible. Old flight instructors used to have this saying that if you have an emergency, the first thing you should do is wind the 5-day clock that's mounted on your instrument panel. Now that sounds like a crazy thing to do. Why would you stop and just wind the clock? But what that does, it gives your brain a chance to settle down for a minute and get back, get out of panic mode and assess the situation dispassionately, and maybe you can find the best course of action rather than just diving for the ground. And unfortunately, I have a lot of experience in both kinds of emergencies. I've had 4 low altitude engine outs resulting in dead stick landings, pretty time critical, and a number of non-time critical emergencies, like losing my alternator over the Sahara at night, losing my fuel system over the North Atlantic, and getting lost in a thunderstorm over Central Africa. But each situation is different. And in this case, even though the 310 was extremely difficult to control, they still had at least 3 hours of fuel on board, and a different course of action might have been to get your gear up, go to full power, and let that left turn happen and execute a climbing left turn, get up a few thousand feet, and try to give yourself some time to deal with the situation. Because that'll give you a few different options. Number one being, maybe you can fix what's wrong. Continue to pound on that right rudder pedal, try to free the rudder. Maybe you've discovered that something had slipped down and jammed the rudders. Maybe somebody's phone fell down there and was behind the rudder pedal. You never know. Give yourself some time to fix the problem. And if they had any kind of directional control, which it looks like they had a little bit, they could have gone someplace else to try to execute this crash landing, because the Boca Raton Airport is probably the worst place to try to put this plane down in this condition, because they only have one runway. Doesn't look like there's much clear area on either side of the runway, and the airport is completely surrounded by trees and houses and buildings and just a lot of built up area, so there's not any room for error at the Boca Raton Airport. And if they could have gotten just 8 miles south, there's the Pompano Airport, which has 3 runways, a lot of clear area on surrounding the airport, and a golf course just next to the airport. So it gives you a lot of different options. Or if they could have gone just 2.5 miles east, they've got the ocean right there. A lot better option might have been to, ditch it in the ocean. If you'd given them some time, they could have got the Coast Guard out there to pick them up after they landed. So, there's different options if you could just stop and think about it for a second. Other benefits to taking your time before you try to land is to give fire and rescue a chance to get in place. They were in the air for just 11 minutes. It sounds like they did contact the tower. We don't have the audio yet, but they obviously had to be in control of the tower. People knew this was happening. But in 11 minutes just wasn't time for the fire engines and the ambulances to get there. It didn't really matter in the end. It looked like it was a pretty horrific accident, but if you've got some time, let them get people in place. And final thing is, the longer you're in the air, the more fuel you burn. They had probably full tanks. I don't know. There was a 3-hour flight, so they probably took off with full tanks. And you got to remember, the more fuel you have on board when you crash, the bigger the fire. So burn off some fuel. They could have even stayed in the air for 3.5 hours and burned off almost all the gas before attempting this land. The plane would be a lot lighter, maybe easier to control, but for sure the fire would be less. Again, we don't know exactly what happened. Maybe they weren't able to climb. Maybe the elevator was jammed as well as the rudder. I guess we'll hopefully find out when the NTSB gets a hold of it. And I know it's super easy to sit back here and Monday morning quarterback it. But what I want you guys to start thinking about is, if you're ever in this situation, stop and think. Maybe wind that 5-day clock. I know we don't have those anymore, but do something. Keep that in mind, because even in a time critical situation, you always have a couple of seconds to think about what you're going to do and make the right course of action. I know normally people have that startle factor when something happens. That doesn't count. That's just you sitting there, startled literally by what's going on, but you have to stop and think and decide what's the best course of action before you just immediately react to an emergency and dive at the ground. All right. Well, that's all I've got for now. Again, thanks for watching. And as always, don't forget to keep your speed up.